Hello. Welcome back to another edition of Money for Nothing. Penny fractions for nothing. I'm here with David Turner, and this is the second edition of this kind of new format that we're doing where Saxon, David, and I, we are sadly minus Saxon, who is in Paris living a better life, I guess. We're just in kind of a kind of more loose, free-flowing discussion of some of the various stories that have been bubbling up, and today we're actually going to be kind of talking through the subject of a recent edition of David's newsletter, Penny Fractions, which you should read if you have not, about kind of like the trials and tribulations of one Patreon. So maybe David, kick it off, and what's going down in the land of people supporting each other to make content that they love in a community, dude, and why you're against that. Tell the people why you're against community.
I mean, community. I'm very against it. Yeah, no. So very recently, I did my newsletter on Patreon, as Sam was just sort of talking about. The reason I was very curious about Patreon, and I guess for a little bit of context in the music in looking at the music industry side in particular, is because Patreon has been around for nearly a decade. It was started by Jack Conte. Conte, I think is how you pronounce that. Conte.
He's got a little He's got a little thing at the top, right?
Yeah, I think so. But yeah, so you may remember him from the YouTube sensation Pamplemousse, which I'm not 1,000% sure I'm pronouncing right, but if I'm not, please do correct me.
Sorry, do that again. I fucked up.
Oh, okay. So he's of the YouTube act Pamplemousse, who you may remember from many YouTube covers in the early 2010s, which I'll be very honest, you may also remember Carmen, who also did a lot of YouTube covers. Do you not? Sam is shaking his head. He does not remember the YouTube covers era.
Yeah, I have no memory of that. They just covered songs?
Oh no, yes, it was like the most like early 2010s hipster looking people who would like cover rap songs and cover like things with like ukuleles and stuff like that. Sam truly has no idea what I'm talking about, which is blowing my mind, honestly.
Is it more like She and Him or more like Rat-a-tat?
Much more like She and Him. Yeah, you can. Yeah, just imagine that. So that's the guy who gave us Patreon. And so yeah, the point of my newsletter was that I kind of wanted to dig a little bit into Patreon because that was started about a decade ago, and when it was sort of first came out, people were really excited by it because all of a sudden your favorite creators on YouTube were all of a sudden like, hey, if you give me $5 a month, that'll mean I'll be able to make way more money than I'm making off the cheap YouTube ad rate, which for him and a number of early creators was really, really successful. And then as time sort of went on, Patreon became much bigger. All of a sudden, all your favorite podcasts and YouTubers are making Patreon pages. And I was like, okay, yeah, this seems like something pretty solid, pretty good. Longtime readers of Penny Fractions will remember I had a Patreon at one point. So I'm certainly not above trying to step into this world. But a few years ago, or at least not a few years, but at least like a couple years prior to the pandemic, I started noticing that Patreon seemed to be kind of going a little bit wayward in the sense that like the company started being like, hey, we're going to take a couple more. They're going to increase the percentage take that they had on each subscription that was coming from people. There was a lot of pushback from creators. And then you sort of had this slow back and forth between Patreon changing up how much creators would make. And then all of a sudden how much that they were themselves as a company taking. And right before the pandemic, they started announcing more like collaboration with people like MIA, the lead singer of System of a Down, whose name I'm forgetting.
Serj Tankian?
This is why Sam is also here to remind me of early aughts bands that I can't remember.
Okay, so I mean, I think that Toxicity is a near perfect album. System of a Down's 2003 album Toxicity. It's another conversation for another day, frankly. But certainly, like, when I read the new Jim Crow for the first time, everyone's like, oh, the prison industrial complex. It's like this new idea that just dropped. I'm like, I'm sorry. I learned about that from the first track of System of a Down's 2003 album Toxicity, titled Prison Song, which includes a series of statistics about the levels of incarceration in the American prison system. That bit. Anyway, that's another. That's a side combo. Some of us like Pomplamoose. Some of us like System of a Down. All kinds of music are represented in this conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Patreon all of a sudden started really leaning on trying to get more musicians to sort of promote the on platform, which in my mind seemed a little bit desperate, but it is what it is. And then the pandemic happened. And when the pandemic happened, Patreon immediately announced that they were going to be doing like layoffs, which, if anyone can remember the early days of the pandemic, a number of companies announced layoffs, but a lot of companies were sort of like, oh, we're freezing hiring. Obviously, no one could see beyond 24 hours, much less a couple months or a year. But then something sort of great happened for Patreon, like a number of internet companies. They got a lot of users, like a lot more users started going to Patreon, subscribing, and there's a real boom for the platform. And so in 2021, Patreon raised $155 million, putting it at a valuation of, I think, about maybe $3 or $4 billion. And I'm already laughing because I think pretty quickly, I think listeners of this show kind of know the trajectory of tech over the last 2 years. Patreon was not immune to that. They've had rounds of layoffs since then. They've really, really struggled to sort of maintain the level of sort of interest that they had at the peak of the pandemic. And I guess the reason why this was relevant to me with the music industry is because of a lot of recent conversations around super fans and is for us to sort of dive into sort of fandom and wanting to sort of figure out ways of better monetizing fandom. So I really wanted to look at Patreon as an example of a company that was trying to do that, succeeded a little bit, but then also to me had a lot of issues and a lot of it raised a lot of questions about is this a sustainable model at all?
Yeah, and this idea of super fans is really interesting because we actually did an episode about it 6 months ago or something like that. But yeah, basically this idea that in a relatively devalued music economy where there's enormous flows of recorded sound but relatively little amounts of money following it, that actually figuring out the people who are willing to throw more cash down the rabbit hole, basically, whether that's this is like the colored vinyl brigade, I would say. This idea that actually, and I think we're seeing this more broadly in the musical economy generally, which is disarticulating listens, that not all listens and not all listeners are worth the same. And that actually, in some ways, as we move away from industrial mass culture, right? Like industrial mass culture is this idea that this is the kind of Andy Warhol thing, which is that my Coke is as good as Elizabeth Taylor's Coke, right? And the way to make money in a mass industrial society is to make a ton of things that are basically the same, make you some profit, and just sell huge numbers of those in a kind of a internet service economy where a lot of the cultural goods are endlessly replicable. They're not bringing that kind of money with them. And so as a flip side of that, we're seeing kind of a disarticulation of that listenership, that in fact, some of these people are worth more, but if we just cap the amount of money they can throw in at a Spotify subscription, we'll never tap that additional money. And in some ways, I mean, you could argue that at least some of this is, I would say, is kind of following. I mean, of course, there've always been fan clubs, there've always been deluxe bonus things, but some of this, I feel like, is a reaction to emergent conditions of social consumption, right? Like that fans were finding ways to spend money in certain cases that the music industry hadn't taken advantage of because they were trying to support artists or trying to find, and I think that in some ways, again, thinking about the pandemic is all of a sudden all of these, when everyone got a lot of free money from the government, or at least a chunk of free money, and then all they had were virtual things and Amazon to spend it on, they actually found a lot of new ways to spend money in online spaces that I feel kind of changed the paradigm a little bit for thinking about these kinds of interactions, maybe.
Yeah, no, it definitely did. And I think that's one of the things that we sort of saw and this is parallel during the big NFT boom and sort of that sort of moment. Sam is already laughing, but it's that moment where all of a sudden people are online and they're sort of hey, I want to support my favorite artists who are saying, hey, right now I can't really make any money because I can't tour. I'm already was struggling because of streaming. I need to figure out a way to sort of to more directly support them is kind of sort of the idea. And so with Patreon, I think what was interesting to me was just one. So I was looking at this sort of website that sort of charts the sort of the engagement on Patreon, how many subscribers there are, how many people are actually like using the platform. And what was really surprising, but wasn't as surprising the more I looked at it, was that basically Patreon's growth stopped in early 2021. Like it peaked really quickly from the, well, not really quickly, but it peaked within a year of the pandemic onset. That was basically kind of the peak of revenue that was starting to happen. It may have gone up like 1% or 2% more over the next year or so, but it didn't really like increase much higher than that. And that really struck me because that is also kind of when people started going back outside again. Like by the time that you get to early 2021, you're getting the like vaccine is starting to get rolled out. By the time you hit the summer of 2021, live shows are starting to kind of return again. And a lot of that money that people had built up that they were spending only digitally all of a sudden had to compete now with live events and other ways of sort of like of other modes of consumption all of a sudden. And that shouldn't have been that surprising, but when I was reading back through some of the coverage, I was kind of surprised, one, that Patreon raised $155 million, because it's kind of hard to imagine more ideal circumstances for a company like Patreon than 2020. Like, it's really hard. I mean, in the moment, I thought it was hard to imagine a better circumstance, but as time went on, it seems even more wild to think of there being a better one. And then I think for like musicians, I think this may have been why you saw this sort of bifurcation where like certain artists were like itching to get back on the road, itching to sort of play shows again, because they kind of could sort of see that like, yeah, I can't be sustained on these digital, like streaming, certainly not, but I can't even be sustained on trying to figure out like, how am I going to create content every month for my Patreon subscribers or whatever equivalent they may have been trying to go to at that particular time.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me, and I don't think I realized quite that Patreon was initially a YouTube substitution, because that's actually it's a weird thing to think about, right? Like that what they were competing with, what it was designed to compete with, was not how much money a musician would get from selling a record, or, you know, for through a label, or even like for like radio play or something like that. It's designed to replace the amount a streamer would get from monetized YouTube. And that's really interesting, because what it's kind of being made to do, which is replace, I mean, honestly, like magazine subscriptions is, I think, that the thing that it replaces most as like a primary vector for the support of American intellectual production, first and foremost, and maybe music second most, if that's a word. And like that's a very different. It's a similar seeming situation, but it's actually quite different. It's quite different, and it's interesting also to think about like that it's made to replace YouTube streaming money in 2012, when YouTube streaming money works really differently.
Yeah, no, thank you for sort of for sort of going in on that. I think we just stick on this for a second, because yeah, like this is YouTube over 10 years ago, where monetization on YouTube was still not as good as it is now. And obviously folks still have their issues with how monetization works on YouTube and all of that kind of stuff, but it was still not that great back then. And also it's kind of strange as we're talking about it, I'm thinking, for YouTube, it's like, hey, those ads are being served, and you're supposed to replace that with people that are watching your videos paying you money directly. It feels so, maybe even when writing, I don't think I realized it quite much, just feels so diametrically like opposed, or they just feel very different. And and it seems like something it's not an and. It feels like much more an and than an either or situation, which I think is one of the things that I found always very interesting about the framing of Patreon and similar platforms like Substack or Twitch or things where it's like, hey, this can be your beginning. This can be everything. You don't need advertisers. You just need this one platform. And I'm always like, well, that's not how traditional media is normally kind of works. I didn't pay for the newspaper and get no ads. I paid for the newspaper and was inundated with advertisements. When I bought like a magazine, I didn't buy a magazine for no ads. I was, again, hit over the face with those ads. And so I always found that like one of the more bizarre things about Patreon is that it basically was like, hey, advertising isn't working. We need subscriptions. But it wasn't to say, oh, you should be figuring out how to interconnect these two things together, how your audience can sort of grow, but also figure out a way to have an audience also pay you. It was, no, you need to go all in one versus doing both at the same time.
That's fascinating because like what is that? It's such like a it's like a very funny, like, there's, yeah, like you're saying, it's like there's two versions. There's like the fallen world of like having to close a bunch of windows really quickly when you open a website, or there's like the pure, untrammeled communion of soul with soul as you support She and Him's new like Hawaiian Christmas album. And like those are the two versions. And no, it's interesting. It is. That's so weird that like in some ways it's hamstringing this model. And in some ways in like it also I feel like gets people maybe a little off the hook in the other model. You know what I mean? Because it's saying like either it's a trash fire and like whatever you fucking want to do is fine because you're selling views. Or you're like this precious little flower that must be protected. And like, actually the middle version, which is like, I don't know, I do think that the publishing industry is an interesting set of comparisons here. Like you're the New Yorker and like you're selling specific ads against a specific market while also charging people money for the content. Because like you exist in capitalism and like what are you you're better than this, like that's like a fascinating, and it strikes me as this like specific utopian strand of internet infrastructure building that's kind of like that's weird. I'm trying to think through it.
So one of the reasons I actually wrote this newsletter, just to be very candid, was that when I was working at SoundCloud and I was on our business strategy team, a thing that I kept running into was this sort of obsession with subscriptions and this idea that like what we need to eventually get to is having creators have subscriptions on their pages and them being able to like, that'll be sort of like the real unlock. It's like once we get that, the margins on that are going to be so great. That'll be the real next level thing. At work, I always had two back in my head thoughts, or some I articulated at work, sometimes I didn't, which is one, there are 1,000 different platforms that offer subscriptions. Instagram, Tumblr, OnlyFans, like everything has a subscription page basically at this point. So I don't know what the like differentiating factor is. And then the other one was, which is again kind of obvious, you don't really, as like the platform, unless you're a Amazon Twitch where you take like 50% of each subscription, Patreon takes I think around like 8%. That's pretty low. So you as the platform actually need a lot of people subscribing to actually make the numbers kind of work on that, because you're not really a platform. That's not really what your business is. It's just kind of like a financial services company. Like you're just kind of skimming a very little bit off of each transaction that kind of happens there. And that's, as a business model, to me, very fraught, because you need a lot of people to be able to sustain that. Or you run a very low, or you, I guess I want to make the joke, or you have Patreon, which if you go to Patreon, a Patreon page is a pretty bare bones experience. It's not super great. So maybe you actually don't need that many people to actually run a site like that. But for the amount of money and capital they ended up raising, it sort of implies that they're going to be operating at a much larger scale than they've proven to be able to sustain.
Yeah, and they don't have any network effects, really, which is the other thing when you're saying, like, which is not even true of some of the other similar, like, gated and non-gated. So I'm thinking about, like, Substack, where there's, like, some network effects in Substack. Like, this is just purely a model for supporting creators. And it doesn't really, it's like signing up for one Patreon doesn't get you more, doesn't, like, introduce you to other Patreons.
No, it doesn't. That's like something they've never really introduced on the platform. Like all of the network effects of Patreon happen basically because podcasts talk about each other or YouTubers mention each other. There's no other way to kind of do that, actually. Or at least the platform itself hasn't incorporated anything like that.
I mean, so pulling it back to music for a second, though, I mean, it's also interesting when you're talking about kind of like the need for large groups of subscribers, is that it does seem like, I mean, again, I'm like at one level very pro this idea. I mean, I was joking before about like community, but like at one level, that's great. I mean, and I do think that finding ways to effectively support artists that you care about is good. And given the ways of the world, like finding ways for the artists that you care about to effectively shake you down for money is actually like in the real, like that's actually like probably what needs to happen. Like no one pays for, I mean, some good-hearted people who are like clearly better people than I am are like, I don't know, Dig subscribers and like support the Dig. But like I'm a bad person and freeload and listen to NPR and don't subscribe because like frankly they don't force me effectively enough. And like I do think that like unfortunately people are terrible and that's kind of the way of the world. So given all of that, as much as I love this idea of community, I am kind of the kind of positioning of this kind of interaction as a way forward for something like the music industry, where it's trying to replace not shit monetization rates at YouTube, but like the record industry of the 90s and early 2000s. I mean, it just strikes me as kind of like wildly idealistic, like that it just doesn't have the lack of kind of force in the commodity flows, like the lack of the ability to like actually make people pay to get access to this stuff means that the voluntary nature of it means that like it doesn't seem like it could create that kind of like large scale systemic impact. And I think to a certain extent it's borne out but my sense, and I mean, you probably know this better than I do, David, but like there's some people who do really well on Patreon, but like so much of the internet, it's like a handful of winners and then a much longer tail of people who maybe in the aggregate make money, but like distributed in such a way that like it's not actually meaningful for a huge number of them.
Yeah, no, Patreon is very much like that, where yeah, there are a handful of creators, basically a handful of podcasts and YouTubers that make tens of thousands of dollars a month. Maybe there are a handful that make like thousands of dollars a month, and then everything below that is hundreds. And then as someone that I think probably at max made maybe 200 a month or maybe like 150 on my Patreon at one point, that the amount of work you're doing, if you were to start crunching those numbers, you're like, oh, that's not really worth it in the end. It's not really worth the amount of posts and stuff that you're sort of doing there. So Sam, what you were sort of saying about not being able to create some of those even cultural moments, that's the thing that I was sort of thinking about as you were saying of, let's go back to the 90s where you have albums that first week drop have like 500,000 sales or like 1 million sales or something. And you're like, oh, there's no equivalent of that on a Patreon or a subscription kind of basis. Now, very different business model, but also because of that, they don't really create moments that people are paying attention to. Like when a new podcast or a new YouTube video drops from like a Patreon, it's like, oh, you're supposed to make content every week, so it becomes like a little bit more, I don't want to say disposable, but it does sort of, there's a little bit less sort of like attention to it, in a way that something I think a lot of us probably thought about this year is when there was the Barbie Oppenheimer moments kind of in scare quotes, but like, yeah, like they were able to build real attention and hype. A lot of marketing went into it, but it was because people had to go pay however $20, $25 to go to the movie theater, put down that money, in a way that if I was just going to I mean, this is the whole Netflix sort of like streaming thing, where it's like on streaming, all the stuff just kind of washes over you. And Patreon to me is kind of even like one step below that, because it isn't even like, you don't even sort of get the same level of pomp and circumstance that Netflix has sort of given a lot of its promotion or some shows, where on Patreon it's kind of like, well, I know the content's going to kind of be there, and that's just not really, it doesn't really build a lot of excitement. And to what Sam, you were saying earlier about those lack of network effects, it means if you didn't get in early, it's kind of really hard to break through now. And there isn't an infrastructure to create new stars or new anything from it, in a way that like the record industry, even today, still has a lot of infrastructure to try to build and create those new things.
I mean, for one, I'm in support of the streaming economy. I'm shocked that you're not excited about Three Stacks' new flute jazz odyssey. And can't believe that you would say people aren't excited about new albums. Plus the fact it's supposed to wash over you. That's the point, dude. Expand your third fucking eye. About the network effects, though. It is interesting, though, but again, thinking about these different models and why something like Patreon is kind of betwixt and between, maybe. Like, thinking, okay, so YouTube, again, of course, for all these things, there's that, like, Beyonce-fication effect, where it's like a certain number of super elite stars have huge amounts of clout and power and influence, make a huge amount of money, and then it's a pretty sharp drop off. But it does seem like that for specific types of culture, like YouTube is a lot of people aren't making it, but like it does, for certain types of culture, it's a somewhat more functional cultural system, at least one that's more adapted to the conditions under which it's being produced. And part of that, I would say, is that platform virality effect, right? It's that I'm a big YouTuber, I make a video, people are going to get pushed to my video who aren't currently subscribers or engaging with my content because of how the overall structure of these networks work. And in some way, like, the very presupposition of a subscriber relationship, like, undercuts that possibility, because by definition there's stuff you can't get access to, and it's not designed for that kind of flow. And then in a system where each individual interaction is so incredibly demonetized and devalued, you actually need like millions and millions and millions of interactions in order to amount to money. And so again, like, because of those lack of network effects, you get this funny in-betweenness of something like Patreon, where again, like, a handful of stars get very heavily supported by their rabid fan bases, but there's not the kind of flowing in and flowing out of a YouTube, maybe.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why, like, it's frustrating. I mean, I'm critical of the model, and I think I was always kind of critical of Patreon. Even if you go back and read my newsletter, I'm pretty sure I'm like very begrudged to be on Patreon even when I was on it. But it was probably just because I was like, this doesn't feel quite right. This feels like something's kind of off here, even though I like the idea of me at that point making a newsletter. People pay me directly for it. You can also subscribe to the current newsletter via Ghost if you would like to. But like, I felt like there was just something kind of a little bit sort of strange and off about that. And I think as we're sort of talking, the bigger this, I think what it's sort of becoming a little bit clear is that, yeah, Patreon was created to try to replace something with you on the YouTube side. But as it was trying to sort of do that, it doesn't really make a ton of sense for how this sort of interacts with sort of like the more, I guess, traditional sort of music industry and those kinds of forms that had, well, I guess not had existed, but still existed today and still existed when Patreon was first coming around. It feels kind of like a weird side thing. And I feel like a lot of these, and this is similar to Twitch as well, which similar in the pandemic, Twitch had a very brief moment where there were a number of musicians on Twitch, and there was like, oh, maybe people can become Twitch streamers, musicians can be Twitch streamers. And it was like, no, I don't think most musicians want to be streaming for like 8 hours a day. That's like an entirely different practice. That's just not being a musician in the same way.
Yeah, and maybe just kind of as we start to wrap up, like thinking about a little bit more closely about what this overall system moving forward can tell us about the music industry. And yeah, again, thinking about this idea of super fans and these the kind of you could say it's like the Taylor Swiftification of the music industry, right? This idea that you can just squeeze more and more and more out of like a large scale fan base, and to a certain extent, even maybe by pitting that fan base against itself, like drive up artificial scarcity on prices. Like if this kind of direct relationship doesn't seem to work for music exactly, well, right, that's the funny thing. Like at some level, certain type of fandoms do work for music, but it does seem like this direct relationship or this way of structuring direct relationships doesn't seem to work for music. And there's like a funny gap in between them that I'm trying to work through, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I thought, so this is making a medium jump, but I've watched a lot of recent YouTube videos about video games, and mostly about people complaining about the modern state of video games, which is a constant complaint of gamers. But one of the things that I thought was super interesting about competitive games was basically someone started pointing out the fact that as games started having more battle passes and making it so you had to buy content basically every month or every other month to incentivize more play, it kind of made it so people would not want to play other games, because all of a sudden it's like, well, I'm playing Fortnite and I'm now spending $20 a month on this game. I don't want to go play another game that's also going to expect me to pay another $15 a month, because I don't have enough time to do that. But also that's now like $35 a month. That's actually a decent amount of money all of a sudden I'm spending on these games. And I think there is something about the subscription model for music that also feels a little bit similar to me, where all of a sudden it's like, if the Taylor Swift fan club costed me $10 a month to get access to whatever that is, I may do that for Taylor. But then if Beyonce comes out and it's like, that's another $10, and I'm like, okay, now we're $20. Then it's like another, and then it's like Blackpink wants it. And I'm like, okay, well, like I actually can't really do that in a way that like, hey, there's a new CD coming out or a new single, I can go buy that. And that is like pretty, like you're making a choice, obviously, as a consumer. When you go to you were making a choice going to the store where your money was going to go, but it wasn't so much of a financial commitment that it was going to preclude you from engaging with other things. And I think that's sort of the thing that I sort of struggle a little bit with. It's like, it seems that like the subscription model like starts sort of like confining you to a certain place, even though it is one that makes it a lot easier. I think both Sam and I will both say, if you're a creator or someone who wants to really think about the work you're doing, knowing that you're going to be getting that monthly income is much nicer than sort of like, oh, I don't know how much I'm going to get when we drop this new project, if we're going to sell 5,000 or 10,000. Like, you'd much rather have the consistent revenue than sort of the like inconsistency of sort of a new release or something.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I don't think I had quite thought about the ways in which, again, this like subscriber relationship there is kind of like a competitive effect to it, especially at like the higher levels of things, right? And we know that, like, kind of my understanding sociologically with a lot of fandoms is like people are a fan of one thing and they don't tend to be like a serious fan of like two things. I mean, at a high level fandom, they're not even allowed, I believe, to be fans of two members of the same group, though you're like allowed to have one, and the rules are very complicated. They've been explained to me before, but I don't fully grasp them. But you know, it's a very different way of thinking about cultural flows, and in some ways, it's also a very different way to structure a culture industry. Because what it does in some ways is it makes it a little bit of a zero-sum game, potentially, right? Like, like your Barbenheimer example is really a good one, right? Like, maybe you could have like people who are going to see both, or you could imagine like a more like annoying version of it, even where it's like you have to choose, right? Are you voting Barbie or are you voting Oppenheimer? But at some level, the way, and like the movie theaters are very good at this, is like what they're trying to do is advocate cinema going as a way of life, right? Because they want to sell popcorn. They at some level doesn't care what movie you go to sell popcorn to, and people go to lots of different movies. They don't only go to Barbie over and over again. And there's a question then, I guess, whether some of this, the subscriber model, when blown up to the level of a fandom, does kind of mean that instead of building out like a music going experience or a concert going experience or a music buying experience, like building out this broader set of social relationships and practices that surround a certain form of commoditized culture, what you get, if you think about like maybe the quintessential example of that is like the record store, where it's like a whole suite of social relationships surrounding purchasing music. Instead, you've got a similar suite of social relationships around music in like a message board for a K-pop group, but it's not, I don't know. I mean, I could be wrong, and I'm not particularly in these communities, but like it doesn't seem to need to like build in the same way. I mean, I'm outing myself again. Like the only thing I've seen semi-similarly is some of this in kind of like Grateful Dead and Co. land, where there's clear like people are fans of one group or another. At the same time, there's like these like structures of concert going, so they go to see a lot of different ones, and that was also kind of structured in an interesting and different way than K-pop, for instance, in that there's like, to a certain extent, BTS is like the biggest, and Blackpink are the biggest K-pop bands, but they're like, I think in the K-pop universe, maybe there's more competition, where like in Jamville, there's hierarchies, so it's like no one's like, oh, I'm a huge fan of like these bands like the String Cheese Incident, and therefore like that I refuse to like the Grateful Dead, because it's like there's a hierarchies, right? Like there's the biggest tent and there's smaller tents, but like the biggest tents are also like the foundational bands of the scene in a certain way, and so like things it's structured somewhat differently. They're not as oppositional, even though there is a similar kind of like sorting fandom, maybe.
Yeah, and I think that's so I think where I'll end is just sort of what you're sort of saying there. I think it actually makes a lot of sense to me. There isn't really a strong music, like individual musician subscriptions community. Like try to think of the music scenes you know of that are based around musicians getting like a monthly subscription. I think they're obviously, and actually, honestly, listeners, if you have them, please send them our way. But I think that there are like certain one-off artists that do have that happen. But I don't think you can really build a scene in that kind of same way, because, yeah, eventually you sort of have to, it does become zero-sum in a way very quickly. And if it becomes zero-sum in something where there isn't already a lot of money to be found, which is a lot of music scenes, unfortunately, then, yeah, I think that makes it even kind of harder to have like subscriptions. If like, I guess I would think of it like this. If you have a subscription and the max that this community could generate is 10,000 subscribers, and there's like $5 a month and it's $50K a month, and you're like, oh, that can only go so many kind of ways, where all of that money pulled together going to individual releases or concert tickets may be able to actually diversify out a little bit more clearly, or not more clearly, but be a little bit more diversified in what it's able to support month over month or year over year, versus like, okay, there's a finite number of people who can spend this much money recurringly every month.
When you said, when you were like, if there's a model of this, I'm like, once again, David, we've reinvented record labels, right? Like,
always.
It's like an indie label, right? Like they have Sub Pop put out the Sub Pop Record Club in like 1990, and every month you would get X number of Sub Pop singles, and they came to your house, and it was different artists every time, but like the profits distributed. So once again, we've reinvented late 80s, early 90s indie rock.
Okay, so yeah, no, I mean, it's like, what are the other ones though? Because I do feel like my issue with Patreon is that like it's I would like for it to make more sense, but it does feel very zero sum. It does feel like something that if this were to extrapolate further and further, eventually I say this as someone that had a lot of Patreons during the pandemic and then have whittled that down to basically like one now. And I'm just like, oh, well, yeah, because I definitely didn't need to support these podcasts or whatever for like 4 years. That actually was like kind of an insane amount of time to support this project. Where if they were like, hey, we need $50 this year, I'd be like, maybe I'll do it. Maybe I'll do it next year. But like, keep that recurring payment, I just feel like is like weighs really heavy on the pocket sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, like another model is like the public radio model, right? Where you have a suite of services, and every once in a while they go like, if you don't give us $50, we're taking them all back. You won't get anything. Just like threatening to fold aggressively. Yeah. And
no, I think that's one, but I mean, honestly, it's unfortunate, but yeah, this is where like in many ways, there's a reason why Dua Lipa's, that was a good one. Dua Lipa's most recent single is coming out as a fucking cassette and CD single, because why not? You got to figure out a way to get some more money out of that. Sam is shaking his head, but like, that's like a thing happening right now. It's like I can already hear Saxon being like, so all of these hipsters were buying their cassettes, and now Dua Lipa's dropping a single. And that's what's happening now. Because what other forms do we got?
I mean, thinking about the forms, like the single, I feel like gets us to this like particularly gruesome moment of like, the new world, the old world is still dying, the new world struggles to be born. Which did bring me back to the point I wanted to ask you about, David, which is about like the very specific historical contingency of the Patreon boom, right? Which is mid-pandemic, and something I've been thinking about, and I think it's going to be really important for us to figure out as critics and close kind of watchers of the music industry, of the creative industries more generally, and as and as citizens of the multiverse, is like, to what extent was the COVID moment a total historical aberration? To what extent was it like preview of coming attraction? And then as things get more and more digital, we're clearly seeing like some of those behaviors either not going away all the way or like moving towards them, or like to what extent almost like with that weird experience of it like shaping the way that things are going to evolve in the future, because it clearly, it is both true, I would argue, that the tech companies and the macroeconomic froth, which is a whole other story really, but like the massive expansion of tech companies and the massive amounts of financing they were able to get was a incredibly short-sighted, perhaps understandable, probably not, but incredibly short-sighted reaction to a very specific set of historical circumstances, and that the world is going to get more and more and more online, that we have not yet come close to peak online, which means that like actually maybe they couldn't support this level of like club quarantine was not the present, but it might actually be a bigger chunk of the future than it looks like from 2024 or 2025. And so figuring out like, yeah, and what like did that specific set of contingencies, like what light does it shed on the development of something like Patreon, where like, no, we're not quite there yet. And yes, when we went back outside, everyone stopped subscribing to their parasocial relationships to their favorite podcasters. But like also, I sort of like, if I had to bet on something, it would be on parasocial relationships to internet celebrities and not to outside.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point, that I think we're right now in this sort of like, we leaped ahead a number of years, and it kind of makes sense we may be stepping back a little bit just because we just made such a massive step. And then also to go back to something like the metaverse and some of those projects, they were really poorly conceived, not super exciting. It was like the idea of us doing like, I think it was I think it was Facebook that was very like, this will be the future of work, was us sort of having our 3D avatars give presentations in the metaverse, which just didn't really make sense. But like the idea of work being more digitized and there being some form of that, I think makes a lot of sense. But again, in the pandemic moment, I don't think everyone was was doing their best work in 2020 and 2021. So it doesn't surprise me that some of the actual like initiatives and some of the projects and some of the work that was being done by these companies, even with billions of dollars behind them, wasn't maybe the quality we might expect in 15 to 20 years of like more normal research development processes and things going into this.
I mean, I also feel like it's important to point out that like the biggest problem with the metaverse is the lack of feet. If I've learned one thing about the internet, it's that it's very focused on feet. And so the idea of launching, like, just, yeah, no, you're right. No one was bringing their A game. Launching, like, we're going to launch a major digital platform. And by the way, there's going to be no feet on it. It's just clearly, it's a marketing mistake. The people like the piggies, right? Like, that's just the way of the world.
Yeah, no, you can't be asking us to live our lives in a world where I can't see below my waist. It's a little much. But yeah, no, I think time will tell to sort of understand how much the pandemic was sort of a future. But I guess in some ways, I sometimes imagine the pandemic as sometimes, or at least I hope it as sort of a bad parallel universe where it was like I very much felt, and this is my own self speaking, is that I felt in 2021 and early 2022, we were veering into some wild places with some of the projects and some of the like extreme crypto, NFT, some of that stuff. I was like, I really don't know where we're going, but I really, really don't like it. And that implosion, I think, doesn't mean the end of all those ideas, but it definitely meant that the version that they were trying to produce back then was really thin. And once it sort of basically, we saw that the Emperor had no clothes pretty quickly, and it's now kind of for those people and people in these spaces is to figure out what is the thing where we actually see the Emperor and are like, oh damn, he really does have a really nice robe today.
Which is where I think we're going to end for today. Will Saxon and I will be back next week with a new episode in the standard format. Thanks so much for listening. Music by Bird Language. Check out David's, if you don't know, you should know, David's fantastic newsletter, Penny Fractions. And we'll talk to you soon. Bye.